Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the webinar on why does disability research matters. This webinar is being organized by the Center of Disability Research and Training, Kirori Mal College, in collaboration with Saksham. The Center for Disability Research and Training was established this semester with the prime objective of promoting disability studies as a legitimate field of academic inquiry. Over the next 5 days, through a series of 11 lectures, we shall try to decode the meaning of disability research. We shall also try to understand and underscore the importance of such research. It shall also be our endeavor to explore the various possibilities that disability as a critical tool of academic inquiry provides us for research. This webinar gathers great significance in the context of the fact that disability, for the most part in the Indian academia, is a marginalized subject. For this reason, the phenomena is yet to become a part of our academic consciousness. In fact, when we first voiced our intention of setting up the center, even the most liberal of our colleagues, who are never tired of flagging feminist, Dalit, and racial concerns, met our announcement with puzzled looks. Looks that seem to question the state of our sanity. What is the point? They seem to suggest. Would a center of this kind be in any way academically viable? Would we find enough people interested in pursuing disability academically? These and other like questions made us approach the establishment of the center with a great deal of caution. But soon, the enthusiasm shown by the younger generation of students and scholars alike silenced the skeptics and put all our fears to rest. In fact, take this webinar, for example. We opened the registration on Thursday. And within a period of 4 days, we had over 430 registrations. 430 because we closed it at 4:30. Perhaps we could have had even more. Definitely, there is a great deal of interest in the subject out there. What is required is the desire to channelize this interest through an institutional site. The Center for Disability Research and Training tries to provide exactly that kind of a site, through which the interest in disability and related issues could be channelized academically, and we could have productive research in the field. But first, we need to understand what we mean by disability research and why is it important. We are extremely fortunate today to have with us Professor Nicholas Watson from Glasgow. Welcome, Professor Watson.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
But before I hand over the virtual mic to you, It is also my great pleasure to call upon Dr. Shilpa Anand to moderate the session. Dr. Shilpa, the platform is entirely yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Someshwar, for the introduction to the seminar series, and also congratulations on setting up the Center for Disability Research and Training at Kirori Mal College. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Nick Watson to this lecture series, and I'm also glad that he's inaugurating it in a way with his lecture. I believe that this lecture series will emphatically assert that disability research does matter. Professor Nicholas Watson is the Chair of Disability Studies in Sociology and Professor at the Institute of Health and Wellbeing at the University of Glasgow. His most recent publication with Tom Shakespeare and others is on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on disabled people in the UK. In Indian disability studies circles, we know Professor Watson by the different editions of the Rutledge Handbook of Disability Studies, which a lot of us use continuously. Professor Watson's lecture today is titled, "What do we mean by disability research and why is it important?" Professor Watson, I invite you to give your lecture now.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you. I very fondly remember my time in Delhi, and it's a city that I hope to be able to return to again, hopefully when things become a bit less fraught than they are now. And I think it's all, you know, I know this from all over India, but I really enjoyed the visits I've had to India, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to talk about this. Today, what I want to talk about today is disability research in general, and why is it important, and what this means in terms of the sort of work we should do, where we should focus our research. So I think it's really important to say at the beginning where do I come from in disability research? What is it that I bring into this? And I approach disability research as both a social scientist and as a disabled person. And both of these factors combine together, and they sort of shaped my understanding of what I mean by disability research. There are, of course, other factors in terms of my work and my understanding. I am from and I'm based in the global north, and I fully accept at the outset that my work is very much situated in this region, and that I'm not well versed in matters related to disability in India. But what I hope is that the general principles I make here today have some value when you go through and look at how you yourselves develop your own understanding of what disability research is. There are, as I will discuss today, a lot of different ways of looking at disability. And while there are things that differentiate what we call disability studies, there are, I think, some underlying principles that apply to disability research. In discussing disability research, we are confronted with both an intellectual and a practical task. We have a practical task focusing on how we study disability, especially we want to develop theoretical and methodological approaches that are fully representative of the disability experience in all its diversity. But we also, and I think this is really important, we have to be able to produce work that's solutions focused. Of course, at times it may be appropriate to research something because we want to throw light on it and to show that something is happening. But we also have to remember that we have to be able to examine the impact in our work and adopt work that allows us to create solutions to the problems that we are uncovering. As academics, and I admit that I'm very guilty of this, we are all very good at highlighting problems. It's something that academics do all over the world. We excel at it. What we're often less good at is pointing to solutions or developing, implementing and testing initiatives that can help to resolve the problems that we uncover. So I think that to do this, social science has got to be able to provide an understanding of what life is like for disabled people, and at the same time, a pathway for the provision of better services and the removal of barriers and practices that serve to exclude disabled people. We need to be able to provide data and arguments that can be applied in reforming approaches to disability in the social, cultural and political world. I mean, what's happened in the COVID and our work on the COVID pandemic has made clear how urgent this reform is. And I also think, I've been looking through, I think research in India, such as that of Anita Guy, also shows how important this work is in India. As Anita points out, there have been a lot of improvements in the legislative framework in India, but the Indian government, she argues, have been largely apathetic when it comes to enforcing the legislation it's passed. She points to the many difficulties disabled people continue to face in India as they try to live their lives. The physical environment remains largely inaccessible, preventing even simple everyday activities such as going shopping or getting to work. Information, she says, is rarely available in accessible formats. There's poor availability of assistive technologies such as wheelchairs, and this disadvantages disabled people. There is, and as much research has shown, very little understanding of what life is like for disabled people in India by health professionals or by those who make policies that affect their lives. Historically then, in India, as elsewhere, disability, and I think at the beginning of this seminar series was made very clear, disability is not really seen as an equality issue, either in India, and it's the same here as well. It's mostly seen as an individual problem, and the way to resolve that is to cure or fix the disabled person rather than to change the society. Having said that, of course, there remain other problems about the level of the individual. In India, there are large problems around access to healthcare and to hospitals, and as Kasturi makes clear, there's a big divide between the rural and the urban experience, and there are huge differences in terms of socioeconomic disadvantage. And I just put this up because I think it's really important that we don't forget that, that if we want to look at the lives of disabled people in India as elsewhere, we need an approach that will allow us to explore their experiences across the breadth of their lives, and that all their experiences are covered. So we don't just want to focus on the barriers, we also have to look at individual factors. So the emergence of disability studies, you know, we've been around for a while, is now very diverse, and as I've said, there's no one simple approach. There is, though, I think, the key defining element. Disability studies is premised on the divide between the individual experience of impairment and the barriers disabled people face. This is the key thing. We focus in disability studies on the barriers that disabled people face, leaving the subject and the subjective and personal experience of impairment, what it's like to live with an illness, very much within the discipline of medical sociology. This is what I think makes our approach unique, and also what makes it political. A point that Guy also makes when she argues that in India, the distinction between impairment or the condition and the barriers disabled people face is not one that is widely recognized. And it's one that, as disability studies scholars, we need to make sure that it's clear. I think that what I want to talk about is that there are three key emerging paradigms of disability research across the world. The first is the materialist accounts, such as the social model. These are the early accounts. Second, we have the emergence of critical disability studies focused around post-structuralism. And the third element are the critical realist accounts of disability, which looks to draw on the work of Roy Bhaskar. And I want to briefly cover or talk about these three different approaches as we go through. So this is the social model of disability, is really, I suppose, the motherboard of disability studies. It is what drove us forward, it's how we emerged. And I think that for us in the UK, and also because through the work of Vic Finkelstein and the work he did with Rehabilitation International across the world, the publication of this document by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, or the Fundamental Principles of Disability, is what laid the foundations. It challenged understandings of disability, and it really was the first to dislodge the association of disability with incapacity and looked at the wider cultural construction of disabled people. So you pious were responsible, as Mike Oliver makes clear, for sowing the seeds of what was later termed the social model of disability in their groundbreaking manifesto, The Fundamental Principles of Disablement. And key here are two activists, Paul Hunt, who was a resident of a Lender Cheshire care home in England, and Vic Finkelstein, who was an emigre to the UK from South Africa, where he had been an anti-apartheid activist, and he was exiled to South Africa. He came here, and and together they were influential in developing the fundamental principles. And Mike Oliver, in The Politics of Disablement, took these ideas, he formalized them, and he recreated, if you like, disability as a problem of social justice, locating the origins of disablement within the state, and particularly, he argued, state-led capitalism and the mode of production. He pointed out that a lot of the promise for disabled people that had been built on the welfare state, that the post-war agreement, was not being achieved. It was seen as restricting individual autonomy. It was failing to produce the liberation that disabled people were promised. They were looking at the things like special schools, care homes, rehabilitation units, segregated workshops, and other services, all served to disadvantage and to segregate disabled people. They benefited, they argued, more non-disabled professionals more than they did those people who they were supporting. They formed part of what Finkelstein and Oliver saw as oppressive regimes that excluded disabled people on the grounds that they weren't able to work as fast or produce the equivalent of their non-disabled peers. Other key developments included within here the emancipatory research paradigm, which argued that it was about that research and disability research had to confront social oppression at whatever level it occurred. It wasn't disability studies unless it was taking this through. I think that this is the simple model that comes from Pius, the social model, which creates this dichotomy, this dualism, if you like, between impairment and disability. Vic Finkelstein took social model thinking and promoted it vigorously, first at the Singapore World Congress of Disabled Peoples International. And they located disability at the way that society treated problems. And this new disability politics that emerged alongside the social model called for changes at the level of meaning and culture attached to disability, changes in the way that professionals, caregivers, and others interacted with disabled people, demanding structural changes at the macro level. While initially developed in the UK, the influence of the social model extended far beyond, largely thanks to activism within Rehabilitation International, eventually influencing the world. And we have a global disabled people's movement now. There was a real sense of optimism within the social model. And I think that we've got this sort of shift as things moved. We moved through, I think that the social model of disability is there's a real sense of optimism in this. And we forget this. It's about saying that we can change lives. It is a utopic model, but it provides a new way of thinking about disability. In fact, Finkelstein wrote an article in 1988 where he called The Village, where he imagined a village where disability that was completely accessible, where disability disappeared. I just want to check with the signer. Am I speaking too fast? The sign language interpreter, am I speaking too fast? Okay, right, thank you. So he accessible and disability disappeared. The social model then marked a sea change in the way that disability was represented. It changed the way we looked at it. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the impact of this model, not just in the UK, but around the world. The disability politics that this model enabled has seen a sea change in the way that disability is treated, shifting it in terms of policy, at least in the political realm. The social model, or at least a barriers-focused approach, is in policy terms the most dominant model of disability and forms the basis of definitions across a range of different settings, from the local right up to the national and transnational, informing policy development in the EU, the UN, the WHO, the WTO, and the World Bank. Whilst it might not have completely changed the practice, the social model has certainly changed the language around disability. Not just in the UK, but internationally and multinationally at the highest levels. Research under the social model paradigm aims to highlight and provide evidence for multiple and significant social inequalities that exist between disabled and non-disabled people, and the systematic and institutional discrimination they face in their day-to-day lives. Importantly, this emancipatory approach is not centered on the experiences of individuals or the way they behave. It's about the relationship between individuals and groups, and it seeks to unpack oppressive relationships and exclusions. It also aims to move beyond documenting these discriminatory practices. This emancipatory research paradigm is a solutions-focused one. It's about working with disabled people, aiding in their politicization and motivation, and providing evidence for altering the status quo and pointing out, hopefully, to some future terms. We know, for example, these are just some statistics that I pulled off the reading. So what's going on in the world? The World Bank estimates that 20% of the world's poorest people have some kind of disability and tend to be regarded in their own communities as the most disadvantaged. 90% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school. According to the International Labour Organization, unemployment amongst disabled people is as high as 80% in some countries. Disabled people are more likely to be the victims of violence or rape. That violence against children with disabilities occurs at an annual rates of at least 1.7 times greater than for their peers without disability, and mortality rates for disabled children is up to 5 times higher than it is for non-disabled children. So with statistics like these, it's easy to see why a strong barriers approach is appealing. We need to focus on the causes of these. What causes this? Why are 20% of the world's poorest? Why do they have a disability? We know that this will obviously be a circular relationship in that poverty causes impairment, which causes disability, but there also might be other things that are going on. Why are 90% of children not going to school? These are the sorts of things we should focus on. But one of the problems with the social model is that it provides but a small one-dimensional analysis of what it's like to be disabled. The social model is coming, it can't take account for the bodily dimensions of both disablement and impairment. How do you account for pain, incontinence, sexual function, fatigue? These become marginalized under the social model analysis. It also homogenizes the disability experience. It doesn't talk about the fact that disabled people are not a single group. It's not a cohesive collective with a common identity and I think there are huge differences in terms of disability and gender, age, ethnicity, culture, class, and geographical location. So we need an account that can take advantage of these. Carol Thomas has tried to meet these criticisms and has developed what she describes as a relational social model. She talks about involving the incorporation of what she terms impairment effects and psycho-emotional disablism within the social model. Impairment effects, she argues, are restrictions of bodily activity that are directly attributable to bodily variations, designated impairments rather than those imposed upon people. So she argues that she employs the term psycho-emotional disablism to distinguish between what she sees as barriers to doing and barriers to being. So psycho-emotional disablism is the impacts and effects of the social behaviors that are enacted between impaired and non-impaired. For example, in familial relations, in interactions with communities and encounters with health, welfare, and educational services. There are things like, you know, somebody who's disabled says, I'd like to be a doctor. Say, you can't be a doctor because you're disabled. It's these sort of psycho-emotional disabilities that work throughout people's lives. Thomas has argued that the sociology of disability should present disability, like gender, as a key dimension of global social distinctions, of division and inequity that can be approached from a lot of different directions. She argues for a mix of theoretical perspectives, methodologies, and research techniques. However, whilst attractive, there are lots of problems with this formulation, not least that, unlike disability, there are no notional reasons to consider something like such as homosexuality, ethnicity, or gender undesirable characteristics, whatever the social context. But there are many impairments that can reasonably be seen as undesirable. Motor neuron disease, depression, or spinal cord injury cause suffering irrespective of the social or cultural environment. And that's why it differs from other protected characteristics such as gender, sexual orientation, or religion or belief. There is also a danger that impairment and disablement under this model become envisaged as dual systems rather than a complex interwoven matrix, and a debate about boundary maintenance can emerge. Is this a disability issue or is it an impairment issue? And Shakespeare argues that it's almost impossible to divide complex experiences into the social and medical. In fact, anyone who does empirical research with disabled people experiences this difficulty. Lived experience is messy. While social structures undoubtedly impact people with impairments, extricating and labeling different factors at work is hard. For example, people with intellectual disabilities, on average, live lives shorter than non-disabled people. Some of this is because the impairment itself is associated with a short lifespan. Some of it is associated with poverty, with housing and social exclusion. Some of it is associated with failures of health and social care services. For example, the inadequate care that's led to the deaths of people with a learning disability in care homes or hospitals. Some of it is associated with eating poorer food in great quantity, sometimes because care and support staff aren't there. Some of the premature mortality of people is the result of aspirational pneumonia caused by food going down the wrong way. Some of this may be the result of being fed too quickly by a poorly paid and inadequately managed care worker who is in a hurry, and some of which is very hard to avoid in a person who has a profound intellectual disability. It would be a very difficult task to neatly divide between social and medical factors. Impairment and disablement are not dichotomous. One can't be ascribed to the social and one to the biological or the personal. They are both experienced at a societal level and become apparent through interaction. These structures are experienced not as facts, but as an outcome. Social structures don't exist outside of the sociological imagination. So this is a quote from Edwin Lemert. Says, social structures are by their very nature reconstructions of reality after the fact. No one ever encounters the reality of structures as such, not markets, not states, not stratification systems. Real people rather encounter insufficient paychecks, impossibly excluding bureaucratic rules and particular slights and injuries, but not the structures themselves. The reality of social structures is always unavoidably composed in the sociological imagination. So structures are perceived as the product of discourse. They occur in language and through social interaction. Social structures are contingent, they're invented, they don't rest on a solid foundation. They're open to change, to local reading, to reinvention. To discuss social structures without examining the language, the signs, the images through which structures emerge is to suggest that structures exist as some form of social reality, some tangible product that can be seen. It is this interaction that should form the basis of any challenge to disablement. These relationships are constructed through impairment and disablement. In terms of impairment, the disabled people's movement should seek to challenge and overturn essentialist notions of normality. And this is here where we enter the realm of critical disability studies. Critical disability studies has emerged as an approach to the study of disability over the last decade or so, and has sought to challenge the predominantly Marxist materialist line found in the more conventional disability studies approach. It is the production of some really interesting and worthwhile research and theorization around disability. In much the same way that the original development of the social model resulted in a necessary corrective to the overly individualized accounts of disability that prevailed in medical sociology, so too has critical disability studies challenged the material line of disability studies. So the main aim then of disability studies is to challenge deconstruct ideas about disability and to explore how these have come to dominate our approaches to the subject and how the ideologies that surround disability have been constructed. It's about unsettling ideas about disability and in so doing shaking up some of our assumptions about disability and critically engaging with the categories used to construct the disability problem. It seeks to deconstruct this binary distinction that it claims are used to create difference and hierarchies within disability and obscures connections between disabled and non-disabled people. Whilst there are many different theorists drawn upon, the various scholars in this paradigm can all be loosely defined as post-structural anti-dualists. In addition to concerns about the binary nature of the social model, the origin of critical disability studies can be located to a large extent, within the emergence of an interest in disability within the arts and humanities, particularly in the US. And I think there's a real contrast in disability studies between the UK and the US. In the UK, disability studies is predominantly located within social science departments, whereas in the US, it's mainly located within arts and humanities, particularly English. So within CDS, differences between disabled and non-disabled people are seen as being socially produced, and it's also argued that these differences are constructed for a political reason to maintain dominance. The standpoint of the privileged and powerful, in this case non-disabled people, has become the norm. Others are seen as deviant and inferior. The aim is that through employing concepts such as ableism, rather than the more typical disableism, the negative stereotypes and cultural values that surround disability and impairment can be challenged and focused away from the person with impairment. So as Davis writes, Leonard Davis has written, the problem is not for the person with disabilities, the problem is the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem of disabled people. So this chief feature is this ableist viewpoint is the belief that impairment, irrespective of type, is inherently negative, which should, if the opportunity presents itself, be ameliorated, cured, or challenged. So it's also based on an assumption that normativity, that normativity acts as a precursor to the normalizing of behavior. One of the problems with this is, of course, that there's no evidence, empirical evidence, to suggest that the categories that are applied to disabled people creates an unnecessary divide between disabled and non-disabled people. Much of the evidence suggests that actually the differences, the way that disabled people are treated, exist before the categorization, and it's actually challenging the categorization. So this normative disruption doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be any evidence for it. Focus of research, though, under this paradigm tends to explore cultural representation of disabled people, the way that stereotypes are reproduced within cultural media, with the aim that negative stereotypes that surround disability and impairment can be challenged and cultural change encouraged. Interestingly, it shares with it the social model's fear or worry about embodiment, because it doesn't really get in and engage with The element of embodiment within critical disability studies is not embodied in the fleshy sense in terms of the reality of living with an impaired body. Rather, the focus is on how medical texts produce an instrumental disabled body, for example, the work of Leonard Davis, or how the disabled body is represented in art and culture, such as Rosemary Garland's excellent Staring, but or what it's like to live with a different body within a culture that devalues that body, but the fleshy reality, what it's actually like to live with an impaired body, does not challenge disembodied rationality in the public place or private sphere. Pain, fatigue, the really embodied experiences of disability are largely absent from these accounts. So the absence of embodiment, fleshy embodiment, both in the social model and the CDS, is of course really important. Also, I think both approaches omit a discussion of agency, the failure to take account or theorize the individual actions of disabled people and what affects their resilience and their abilities to meet and challenge disablement. There is a danger that disabled people are no longer seen as victims of their impairment, but as victims of either structures or cultural values. But whatever way you paint it, they are still victims. So what I want to try and do is make a case for a new approach. This is drawing on work I've been doing with Tom Shakespeare and Tom's work as well, in other work, and work I've been doing with Simo Viermas and his other work, and work by David Pilgrim and others around the emerging use of critical realism. So we need, what we're arguing for is that I think we need an approach that can take account of different conditions, structures and practices that impact on and create disability. Partial accounts that focus on either the cultural practices or on social barriers are not adequate. The experience of disablement is very complex. You know, even the 2001, this is if you look at the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, this doesn't resolve it either. It's failed to analyze personal factors, that it doesn't take account of the role of culture. Thomas's recommendation that the sociology of illness should be separate from disability studies is not a solution either. Biological, psychological and social factors need to be understood, and they're the way that they interact with each other. These interactions impact differently on different people with different impairments, and other dimensions of their biography are important. Gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, locality, these all play a role. Equally, in the search for intellectual resources, critical disability studies doesn't really do that either. There's been the focus on the cultural discourse and the assumption of able-bodiedness is interesting, but less helpful when it comes to understanding material social relations, what it's actually like to live as a disabled person. So in researching disablement, we need to take account of the interpersonal and relational, financial, occupational, environmental, sensorial, local and social conditions. So here I want to draw on the idea of Roy Bhaskar and others such as Margaret Archer, Andrew Sayer, Gareth Williams, Graham Scambler and David Pilgrim to argue that these aims can best be achieved through the use of critical realism. This allows, I argue, the incorporation of both the structural analysis whilst conceding a central role played by agency. It allows the emergence of an emancipatory project, because an emancipatory project has to both define the subject, in this case disabled people, their possibilities and capacities, and the layers that deny or suppress these. It involves unpacking the social processes of structure and agency that shape and reshape one another over time. It's about exploring how agency is influenced by structure and vice versa, without overemphasizing either agency or structure. So a critical realist account then allows us to move beyond beyond debates about what disability is and how it can be defined, what it is or not on an impairment, what is or what is not an impairment, and what is the relationship between impairment and chronic illness. It permits an examination of the experiential basis of impairment and an exploration of the day-to-day problems associated with living with a condition without reducing the disease to either a social construction. It allows us to bring the body back in and theorize impairment and its lived experience as part of the human embodiment. It does this by developing what Bhaskar has called he calls it a laminar approach. And what Bhaskar says, it entails the identification of causal mechanisms of structure that pull this together. But we have this idea that Bhaskar says that we have to explore the problem at the most suitable level. So we have a laminar approach and we have to justify our level, but at the same time recognize that these different things go. So we can look at the sub-individual. Sometimes we can look at the psychological, exploring attributions of motives and reasons for action. Why do people do these things? We can look at the individual, the biographical and the narratives that people construct. And what we have to do is we have to be able to justify why we've taken that approach to it. So we can look at the micro, the meso, and the macro. So it's theory driven, but it's not theory laden. There's an exploration of the ontological and a critique of the social, which providing the way forward. It is multidisciplinary. There's no, and I think the philosopher Mary Midgley said that we can look at that we have one aquarium and we can look at the fish within the aquarium through lots of different windows. And each window gives us a slightly different picture of what's going on. And this is the thing about critical realism, is that we recognize that if we want to unpack disability, we have to look at it at a lot of different levels and a lot of different ways in. And if you like, I think sometimes you could say that a critical realist approach is like having your cake and eating it. You can go through lots and lots of different perspectives. You can look at different ways that you can go through this. So in the social model, we focus on the meso, the macro, and the mega in this approach. All of these layers are essential to the understanding of the phenomena of disability research. We live our lives in interacting and interarching spheres, processes, and procedures. These intersect simultaneously. And it's this that disability studies, that critical realism, allows us to access. We need to have a way of bringing in fatigue, pain, and impairment, and how they contribute to exclusion. An exclusion that cannot be extracted from the overall experience of disablement. But the role of disablism has to remain centre to any of these approaches. It does intermesh. It is, if you like, the thing that underpacks it all, as interrelates. Few would argue that the macro and mega are really important determinants of the cultural and social political lives of disabled people, but they are only part of the picture. They interact with and fashion narratives that in turn relate back to the meso, macro, mega. It's a dynamic relationship. In research terms then, this approach allows us to start with disabled people at the centre and to examine the activities they engage in, why they engage in them, or why they think they engage in them as they construct and sustain social practices, structures, and relationships. It also allows us to reference the material and structural and how these are conceptualized. And I think the final point, it allows us to move beyond an approach that privileges either the individual, as found in medical sociology, or the social and structural, or the cultural. It provides a full, more accurate account of disability and the lives of people who are disabled, and points to a future way of solving problems. Thank you very much.
That was an overview of some of the dominant trends within disability studies research, but I think it most importantly opens up this area of critical realism, right, and critical realist research in relation to its departures from the social model approach, as well as critical disability studies. So I'm hoping that as we go through the Q&A section now, we will be able to learn a little bit more from you about how that could be done, how can that be operationalized, because I realize that one of the tensions that exists with doing critical disability studies is that it becomes theory laden, if I got you right. and does not allow for an intermingling of both the materialist as well as notions of embodiment. So what I'll do now is open up the floor for questions. Would you like to take a few questions at a time, Professor Watson, or should we go one by one? Because there are already some questions in the chat box.
I think whatever people go easiest, whatever is the easiest way to take it. Sometimes taking a few questions at a time means you miss a question. So it's sometimes easier just to take one question at a time.
Okay. Let me read out one from the chat box. It says, how do we deal with the anthropocentric nature of disability studies? Impairment is not human specific. How do we deal with impairments in non-humans?
I mean, I find this quite interesting I don't know how we deal with that because I'm not. It's not the area I work in, and I do put humans about in terms of equality. I'm focusing on what it's like to be a disabled person. We don't know how animals deal with impairment. We don't know what it means to an animal to be impaired. I have a very old dog who's lying down here asleep next to me. He's 14 years old. He walks around slowly. I don't know if he seems fine, but he limps a bit. Is he disabled? I don't know. How do you understand it? I don't know. So it's not an area that I fully understand, and I wouldn't really know how to answer that question. Sorry.
All right. Thank you. Let me go on to another question. There's one question from Sumit Garg, which says, how can literature as a tool help us have a better understanding of disability studies?
If you mean literature as in reading, as in literature that we read, the books that we read. So I think there's some really interesting work to look at how are disabled people represented in literature, and that gives us a way of exploring the cultural stereotypes that disabled people experience. And in much the same way that we look at developing post-colonial literature or developing literature on the way the representation of ethnicity or sexuality within literature. And we've got, if you look at, queer studies starts talking about the assumed heterosexuality that's within a lot of cultures. So I think the same within the assumption that disabled people, so if we look back to, some of the very early work on disability studies looked at literature, particularly D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was quite a big book in the 60s, and the way that the disabled Lord Chatterley is presented as just this incapable person in a wheelchair. And I think we can look at lots of cultural representation of disability. It gives us a grasp on the stereotypes that impact on disabled people. And I think that's really interesting. But we also need to look at how that is it. What experience does that have on disabled people? So if disabled children are reading this sort of literature, how does it make them feel about themselves? So I think it is a really important way of going through. But it provides it gives us one, I think it's a really important thing, and we should be looking at, but it is but one element of the work we should be doing. This is the point I'm trying to make. Disability studies needs to be looking at this aquarium through lots of different windows.
Thank you. I think if participants want to ask questions or pose comments, they're welcome to raise their hand as well. Samir, I think you had a question.
Yeah. I have couple of questions, like critical realist stand of Roy Bhaskar, which you mentioned. It is bit new to me, like I haven't dealt with it at length. So can you explain, as in, interplay between structure and agency has also spoken by Luckman and Berger. And in some ways, Merleau-Ponty also deals with it. So can you explain it a bit further? And second question is something like I'm thinking about this thing for quite a long time now. Like it is not like it is something to do with studentship, as in, I was reading this book by Bill Hughes on history and disability, and it was impacting me as a reader, right? But I have seen uh, among colleagues, uh, there are people who are doing their research by utilizing Goffman, but it seems that it has no impact on them. Like reading Stigma of Goffman opens up many layers of one's being. So, a comment from you on the studentship part of doing academics. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure quite, but okay. So Bill Hughes is a very good friend of mine. He lives just down the road from me, actually here, and we regularly meet. And I think his book is a fantastic book. The way that he's unpacked and looked at sort of historical representation and the way that this has created difference and what this has taken out. But the problem is, of course, and we have to look at, and this allows us what work like that by Bill Hughes and by others allows us to do is to see where cultural practices towards disabled people might have emerged. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow us to see, well, how do we challenge those cultural practices? What do we have to do? So I think Bill's work essentially showed that in the early and middle ages, disabled people were both good to do harm to and good to do good to. And so that created that welfarist approach. But I think that what we need to do is we need to look at causal mechanisms or structures that determine these sort of social outcomes. What are the causal mechanisms? So Andrew Sayer, he argues that we need this evaluative description. We need to identify what makes people flourish, and we need to identify where are the barriers, what are the barriers that disabled people face, and also their source. So without these, we can't develop this adequate understanding of social life. And I think it's a very, very complicated way of it. Sorry, it can become complicated if you try to think about things too broadly. But like I said, you're about describing what you're doing, and then it's where does your approach fit within that laminar matrix that Bhaskar talks about. So I think it's really good that if you start to recognize the work that you're doing is only partial, but you locate it within a laminar framework, you can start to see where different relationships might emerge through that picture. Is that clear? I hope that is that answered your.
Samir, would you want to respond?
Yes, yes. And what about the second part of my question? It is quite a general question. Like, I feel disappointed when I see students reading Goffman, but not really reflecting on it, or reading Foucault only to get good grades, but never beyond it.
I think that's it's a valid point. And I think that one of the problems with, I think Goffman says at the end of Stigma, which I think is a fantastic book, and is that he says, of course, the problem for the stigmatized is not that they're being stigmatized, it's what's causing that stigmatization that we should really be looking at. And I think there's a real, I think you're right, that there's a real issue to sort of, it's not just about describing the stigma that people experience, but it's about why do they experience stigma, and then how can we stop that stigma. I think Foucault's slightly different, because I think Foucault's very, very difficult to engage with in that way of seeing what would be a practical structural outcome that you could implement. I think Raewyn Connell makes the point that, there are no post-structuralist policies. We've never seen post-structuralism put into social policy. It's very, very difficult to put it in. So we come across, it gives us a really good understanding, but is it possible to apply sort of Foucauldian thought within the construction of policy? I find that very difficult.
Like reading Foucault gives you this much clarity that disability or stigma associated with it is a discursive construction. So we can actually rehabilitate attitudes of non-disabled people using Foucauldian model. Using Foucauldian model, we can rehabilitate attitudes of non-disabled people.
Sorry, I'm getting a lot of people talking over there. I didn't hear that.
Like,
Everyone just mute their microphones, please. And only Samir and Professor Watson have them on.
So
like,
can you say, so what, I'm not quite sure what you're looking for, Samir.
yeah. Like my position vis-a-vis Foucault would be like, if I am teaching Foucault, I would expect my students to understand disability as a discursive construction, and then probably engage with disability as like, probably they can then able to problematize the whole stigma business which we disabled has to face. So
yeah, I think I think that if we look at, for example, Foucault's work, what if we were to his work on critique that for example Judith Butler uses a lot, and I think we could understand that, and we can critique our stance on disability. We can go away, we can engage with it, we can critique why do we speak about disability this way, what do we do, then we then have to take that and say, well, what do we do to challenge that? And I think that to me is the key problem. It's not, the point I was trying to make is that we need to have solutions focused work. At the moment, we're very, very good at identifying problems, less good at identifying solutions.
That is the thing I am hitting upon. Like, even studying something critically is a kind of activism. But what my problem is with probably my contemporary colleagues, like they are not being able to read it in that, or they lack that passion for that critical engagement. Like I am making a point, even studentship can be activism of different sort altogether.
Yes. Yes, I think so. I agree. I mean, I think that it's a very difficult, and it's about moving forward, and it's about encouraging students to take these ideas and to think. But I also think, you know, with students, it all depends what level of students you're looking at. But with students, I think it's very important that we allow students to develop their ideas and understandings, and that sometimes this takes a while. I mean, when I think I took me a long time to get beyond just being really fascinated with Foucault's work, to start to critically engage with Foucault. And it's a very difficult, as a student, it's very difficult to start engaging and criticizing and critically using such established scholars as Foucault. I think that's a problem.
Thank you, Professor Watson, and thank you, Samir, for those questions. We can probably loop back into critical readings and how we engage with them as students and researchers. I'd like to go on to another question that's in the chat box.
If you allow me, can I ask a question before we move on?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Professor Watson, I really admire the way that you have sketched the development of disability studies in a way from the social model to the critical disability studies format to the critical realism format. But if I draw your attention to your writings recently, you bring in these questions of emancipatory disability studies and the question of disability and social justice. Where exactly would you place these two concepts within your schema? Could you elaborate on this for the benefit of everyone present here?
I mean, I think that for me, work is about, research is about social justice. That's my drive is about developing or tackling and looking at ways that we can make life more fair and more equal for people who are disabled. And I think that would, I think, be my primary aim. I think one of the problems with Emancipatory, but that doesn't also mean that at times we can't do research that is uncovering. So if I look at, for example, say the early work by Tom Shakespeare on disability and sex, that wasn't emancipatory as such, but it was uncovering a problem that needed to be explored. But whereas I think that you would then look at later work, such as Don Kulik's work around the provision of sex workers in Denmark, both as so it's uncovered the problem and it's looking at a solutions-focused way of looking at it and creating a socially just response. So I think that it's how do we look at that's a simplistic, that's quite a simplistic thing, but I think that we do want our work to be solutions focused, to look at new ways of developing inclusion, new ways of removing the discriminatory barriers that disabled people face. So, for example, recent work that we did looking at the experiences of disabled people with learning disabilities or with neurodiversity or mental health problems in the Scottish court system. What we were trying to point there was not just to uncover the fact that they couldn't get access to support services and they couldn't get the support they need, but also to make recommendations as to how policy could be changed to improve that. So that's about providing social justice and looking at that. So I think that it's important both to look at uncover problems, but also to look at ways make recommendations of new ways of going about it.
Thank you, Professor Watson.
All right, I'm going to go on to a couple of other questions that were in the chat box. One is from Madhumita, which asks, how do you think about disability life writing and its implications for this field of research? What do you think about its implications?
Do you mean people talking about their lives as disabled people? Is that what, I don't know what you mean by disability life, by autobiographies.
Yeah.
I think autobiographies are really important. They give us another access into how people live their lives and what it is they do, and that you will look at it will give us an account of their individual agency, the steps that they've taken to challenge disablement, what they think have impacted on their lives, and the structures as they see them. And I think it's a really important way. But of course, some of the things is one of the interesting things is we like disabled lives when they adopt an emancipatory approach, when they look at the oppressive practices. What about people who write about how dreadful their life is, how unbearable their life is, from a perspective, if that's what they write, and that becomes very difficult to challenge sometimes. So I think that we have both. Looking at this, isn't there a difference between, as a social scientist, my role, I see, is to look at the evidence I collect and then to create new ways of looking at that and to promote it forward. Now, of course, autobiographies are one way of doing this and might be one source material, but I think there has to be some engagement with social theory to move it into social science. That construction, analysing what it is that's causing these factors. I think that's the difference between autobiographical writing and actually, and I think there's some really interesting work within feminist literature, such as Liz Stanley's work on autobiographical writing as feminists, and I think that's a really important way to go. But it's that engaging with the structures and the practices and the cultures that exclude people at the same time.
Thank you.
Dr. Shilpa Anand, Rajesh from Punjab University, Chandigarh.
Yeah.
Can I? Thank you so much, Professor Watson, for a wonderful talk. I have just like a question regarding some terminological difference that are very often used in the discourse of disability studies. One, how disability is different from disablement. Do you see any difference between the two terms, disability and disablement?
No, I think they both mean the same thing. There's a difference between disablement and ableism, though, between disability and ableism. I think there's difference between those two, but I think disability and disablement are just different expressions of the same thing.
And likewise, sir, these three terms, disability, impairment, and handicap. So this handicap term that I fail to make sense of, like how this term is used in the area of disability studies.
Sorry, I didn't
handicap, the impairment,
I
disability, and handicap.
Well, handicap is a word that isn't really used anymore. So we just talk about disablement and impairment, and the word handicap has sort of fallen out of use. I think it has uncomfortable historical origins, and disabled is saying you're disabled is a much more political thing, because you can say I'm disabled by the state, I'm disabled by society. So that's why, and handicap tends to be a bit more personal, and that it's your responsibility and you hold it. So it's tended to slip out of usage, and we don't use it anymore.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, going on to another question from the chat box. It's about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on people with disabilities and the research that needs to be done within that field.
Well, I think that, the COVID pandemic has impacted on disabled people in a number of ways. First of all, many disabled people are more at risk if they catch COVID. So we know that, I think in the UK at one point, 60% of people who died of COVID were disabled in some way or other. So the disabled people were one of the most affected groups. But of course, remember that lots of older people, it also impacts on age and disability come together. But disabled people are much more at risk, and certain conditions, such as Down syndrome, makes you're 6 times more likely to die with Down syndrome if you get COVID than you are compared to somebody who doesn't have Down syndrome. So disabled people are much more at risk, but also the disabled people, the way disabled people have to live their lives at the beginning of COVID placed them much more at risk. Either a lot of disabled people were in congregate living in care homes, and COVID ripped through care homes because once it got in, it moved very, very quickly through it. Or if you live on your own and you have a care worker coming in, that care worker coming in and out of your house every day means that you can't control people coming in and out of your house in the way that your lockdown is much harder to sustain if you have to have people coming in and out of your house. So it impacted on that way. And then I think one of the other things that it's really impacted on disabled people, and I can only speak here about the UK, is that disabled people weren't consulted about what should happen. They weren't consulted about the implications of some of the decisions. So we closed down day centres, we closed down support units, we closed down these because we didn't want people to come together. But what we didn't do was we didn't look at what were the implications of this. So many disabled people, particularly those with a learning disability, their social relations, their friendships, were constructed through going to drama groups, going to theatre groups, going to cookery classes and so on, art groups, and these were closed down. So it meant that many people with learning disability were living very segregated lives. Now, there were some really, really fantastic steps taken by the third sector who stepped in. They ran online groups, online friendship groups, they ran Zoom groups, they had Zoom karaoke and so on. But I think that was because they had to compensate for the failings of the state. So I think as we move into a post-COVID state, we've got to look at, the other thing as well. What COVID did was it exposed weaknesses that were already there, and it played on those structures. So it played on the other groups who've been hit very hard in the UK, groups from ethnic minorities, because they live in poverty, because they live in overcrowded housing, because they live in their housing. So that this is the other group. So there's Claire Bamber describes the COVID pandemic as a syndemic. That is, it's exposed the weaknesses within our society. It's unpacked and it's taken advantage of them. So discriminated against groups have suffered more. We know that the poor have suffered more. So it's come through and it's created this. And I think we've got to, as we come out of the pandemic, we don't want to go back to what we were like before the pandemic. We need to go to a new future. It's not building back to what we were before. We need to build to a new future, one that disabled people are more included in, because the high death rates that disabled have been excluded because of their exclusion.
Thank you. It's very tempting to go on talking, as the questions come up, but I think I want to give everyone a fair chance to get their questions in. So Sharda's question is about your take on using a reflexive approach to research when the person doing the research is a person with disability.
So I think that this is very interesting, isn't it? This notion of reflexivity. And of course, we have to be reflexive, we have to be aware of our position, and we have to take account of it. And we have to acknowledge, I think, that there is this reflexive thing. We have to acknowledge where we come from, and we have to acknowledge our history and how this frames the way that we read the research. So I think, it's interesting. One of the interesting things, I think, though, is as a disabled person, we have one view of disability. An undisabled person might have a different view. But what we have to be able to do when we do reflexive research is to justify our approach. We have to be able to say, we have been robust in our research methods. This is my feeling. We have taken we have taken decisions based on evidence that we can sustain and we can substantiate our claims. So I'm still thinking that we acknowledge our position, and that's that reflexive approach, but we also have to be able to substantiate our claims, and we have to be able to justify why we've taken this approach and why we've put forward these findings. I think that's one of the key things within there. So it's not enough to say, I feel like this because I'm a disabled person. You have to be able to say that this has happened because of this. This is what I substantiate my claims on.
One thing, Shilpa, just one thing.
Samir, there are lots of people with questions.
Just, I'm adding. Professor Watson, you argued about substantiating with evidence location of being disabled. That is all right. But what about if a disabled is doing research from a particular vantage point and his or her supervisor ask him or her to be objective, that a value neutral Max Weberian thing? What is your take? How academia should deal with this location of disability? It is not very popular in academic, I believe, world over, or probably in South Asia.
I mean, I think that it's very, very hard to claim objective neutrality in any work we do. We have to acknowledge our own position, and I think that how would I do when I analyze the data? I obviously, because I'm mostly a qualitative researcher, I'm framing it through my own mind. But what I have to do is I have to be able to substantiate it and show that actually I didn't just do this because of what I think. I have based it on, these are emergent themes. These have come through. So I think it's a very difficult balance to do. And I think doing a PhD is very interesting because you do this work yourself. And so you have to be able to, you're on your own ethicality of being honest and that you're using these research properly. When you're part of, so the work we did on COVID, for example, there's a massive research team of 8 of us, and we all read interviews and we all looked at emergent themes. So we're constantly checking with each other about, is this right? Is this right? So we've not looked at it. We've not been, if you like, biased, because we've had to work with each other and justify our accounts. And sometimes I think when you're doing a PhD and you're on your own, it's your ethicality, and that can be quite a complicated place to be. And you have to be able to still justify. But that's what your examiners do when they look at your methods. They ask you to justify your approach.
Thank you. Go on to Saksham's question. Where do we situate the medical establishment, which has been sidelined in the earlier models, once we reintroduce the embodied experience of disability?
I think this is a really interesting and really good question. I'm not of the opinion that people become doctors because they don't like disabled people. So I think that most people who work in medicine, most physios and so on, you know, they're working to help us. And I think we need to work with rehabilitation. You know, I broke my back and I was in hospital for 9 months, had daily rehabilitation. And I think the physios did a fantastic job about focusing with me and working with me. But also we need to look at both, we need to work together, and people need to use their expertise where they have it. And maybe, you know, a spinal cord surgeon doesn't really need to know as much about how you create impact or how you create, access as, say, somebody whose work is an occupational therapist. So we need to look at where we do it. And sometimes, you know, that sometimes we need to expect people to be, we need a social understanding. And I think doctors do increasingly get that social understanding. And when you talk to them, when you talk to specialists in the field, they have a strong social understanding, but they're also working within their medical tradition. So if you look at one of the great things I think about the critical realist approach is that it allows you to look at that, but people then have to acknowledge that there are these other areas that are going on, the meso, the macro, the mega, and the global. And I think these are really important. And I think, you know, one of the other things I haven't really talked about is that, you know, disasters, great disasters like climate change is creating huge problems for disabled people. Natural disasters, disabled people always come off worse. The COVID pandemic has exposed it, but climate change will be a huge problem for disabled people as weather changes, and whether or not disabled people will be another big thing that hits through. So there's global things hit very much as well.
Thank you. I'm going on to Praveen's questions in the chat box. There are two, but I'm going to quickly read them out. Is there a looming danger of different models limiting disability studies? That's the models approach.
Yeah.
Sometimes probably we get stuck up with models than address the disability issues. And secondly, can critical disability studies and critical realism be combined with discourse analysis?
Well, I think that obviously if you become too fixated on one model, then it can limit. And also we can end up spending ages talking about models rather than talking about disabled people. And I think that's a definite problem, that we can end up talking a lot about how many angels can dance on a pinhead rather than actually looking at the problems that disabled people face. So I think there is a problem that would become too insular in that respect. I think your final point, the question about, so critical disability studies, discourse analysis is a part of both critical disability studies and also critical realism, but it's not for critical studies, critical realism, it's not the only part. It will be it's appropriate where it's appropriate. So you can look at the discourse that creates the social policies and so on, and that's really important, but you also have to unpack other things as well that go around it. And so you have to look at these different levels. So discourse analysis provides one way in, and it's an important way in, but there are also other ways of looking at the aquarium. Other windows are available.
Yeah. Thank you. I think your answer also responds to Sanskriti's questions. There's a series of questions in the chat box about the intermingling of these different approaches to studying disability, and also does the critical realist model account for the affective practices of reading, writing, and researching for the researcher, and if so, how can this be done? I ask this because it is not necessary that one's feelings during readings can produce solutions, but it is likely to take the inquiry in a multiplicity of directions, making that a journey, one which may or may not result in concrete solutions or ends. I think that you've addressed that, Professor Watson, those series of questions. Shall I go on?
Yes, yeah.
How does research on disability help in real life? Again, I would think that most of what you've spoken about has...
I think the question before, there's a really interesting question about the Global South, which I think I don't know whether or not to unpack, how we would unpack this about does critical disability, I've got a direct message, so it's come direct to me about, do I think that the Global South could benefit from incorporating disability justice? And I think it could do, but I think, you know, again, this is not for me to impose on the, this is, I think, this is where, I think in India, when you start working with disabled people, when you do your research, you have to decide where do we focus on global justice, on social justice, and where do we focus on the individual, on the right to medicine, on the right to, you know, I know that in the UK, life expectancy for people with spinal cord injury is pretty much unchanged when you get spinal cord injury. Then that it is not the case in many areas in the Global South. So if you're working with spinal cord injured people, you have to look both at access, but also at access to healthcare, access to clean water, access to clean continence products, access to good skin care, and so on. And this is where you need to look at it. So you have to locate it where you need it very much.
All right, thank you. I think that was Jyoti's. It's also in the chat box. Yes, Sachin asks, Professor Watson, thank you for the engaging lecture. Can you please elaborate on the engagement between institutionalized academia in disability studies and the totalitarian right-wing ideologies in power that have been disabling the individual and collective rights increasingly? If you can elaborate against the conceptual frameworks of state of exception and necropolitics, that would be great. I'm
not quite sure, because clearly we both have populist governments in power at the moment, with populist leaders who, and we have there's a danger, I think, that sometimes some of our work around identity politics allows populist leaders to knock identity politics, which is, I think, a problem that we're facing sometimes. I'm not quite sure actually where I'm going with this, but I think we have to provide, when we work with these ideologies that we've got going in power, the only way we get through them is just, I think, by providing evidence, by challenging, by showing again and again and again, this is about discrimination. And I don't know what we can do in further unpacking this as academics. We provide the evidence, we can provide the evidence, we can make solutions, we can show how this can work, and that's all we can do, I think. You know, I don't think we can, you know, I'd often like to think that disability studies could, you know, bring down and change capitalism, but I don't think that's going to happen. So, you know, I think we have to learn to work within these, and you know, we have to be looking at how do we move towards. I'm not quite sure what this sort of state of exception means, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't know what we can do. We can't bring down populist governments as academics, but we can provide evidence that hopefully will gradually wear away and erode at the power of populist governments.
Thank you. I think that question refers to Agamben's concept and other theorists working on biopolitics, right, and so on. But let me just go on to Insha's question, but I think that you may have already answered it, about autobiography being one of the major data sources of disability research, but it being charged or being self-centered and unreliable because of memory issues. How would disability research respond to that question?
I mean, I think I covered that before. I think that, you know, it is one source of evidence, but we need other sources of evidence. And I think we also need, you know, we need big quantitative evidence. We need to be able to show that, I mean, in the UK, we know that 7% of people with a learning disability are in employment. And that's dreadful. And those large statistics enable us to put that through. We know that people who are disabled, who have learning disabilities, die 20 years sooner than their peers. That's a dreadful statistic. But we need to do that sort of thing, we need big data as well. So autobiography is one way, but we also need large data. We need quantitative evidence to back up our claims as well. So it's not, as I said, it's not just one window into the aquarium. We need all of these different approaches to allow us to tackle these problems.
All right, thank you. I think I'm going to just ask you one more question because we've gone on for more than 40 minutes with the Q&A. This question is about, it uses the phrase mental disability, but I think it's setting up the question of how does one research mental disability?
I mean, by mental disability, do you mean learning disability or do you mean a mental health problem? I'm not quite sure which one.
Radhika, would you like to respond?
A mental health problem, sir.
A mental health problem. Well, I think that, again, I think it fits within this very well. And my colleague, Richard Bruner, if you look at Richard's work in the Routledge handbook, his book on mental health problems, I think you show how you can use this approach within critical realism. And much of the work, much of the, you know, one of the big influences on me as I developed my ideas around critical realism and disability was the work of, God, his name's gone. I can't remember his name, but he was some of the early work around critical realism, and I'm just looking for it now. Here we go. David Pilgrim. He brought in critical disability studies. It was his work that was one of the first, most influential when I started to look for new ways of understanding it. So I think it fits very, very well. And I think that, you know, there's a great book by Nicholas Rose called Our Psychiatric Futures, where, you know, he's able, in that book, he brings together lots of, he's not a critical realist, but you look at it, you can see lots of different approaches. And I think, you know, again, it's really interesting work to be done around Foucauldian work on representation of mental health problems. But there's also really important to start looking at, say, the material role that capitalism plays in the creation of mental health problems. How is capitalism responsible for all mental health problems? No, but it plays an important role either in exacerbating or in creating some mental health problems. And we should be looking at that. You know, what is the role of poverty? What is the role of racism? What is the role of all of these different things have to come together and look at it. So it's not just about cultural representation or the culture or the creation, discourse analysis around the creation of mental health problems. So I think there's a lot of different, we need that materialist element as well as the more, as well as within the sort of Foucauldian representation.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Tarun to ask his question. He says he's had his hand raised for a long time. I'm sorry, I missed it. Tarun, would you like to ask your question? Tarun, are you here?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. Thanks very much for this wonderful talk. And my question is that, say, if in an interview, a respondent says that, say, his productivity is hampered, I mean, he has got low productivity. And say, if we talk about critical disability studies perspective, then we could say maybe it could be attributed to internalized ableism. You already talked about this social model wherein it is really, really difficult to attribute it to social barriers or maybe impairment effects. But then how does this critical realism deal with it? I mean, because it is multifactorial, as you said, and there are different levels. So, I mean, doesn't it make it difficult to actually do empirical research?
I think actually it makes it easier because we can start to look at it from lots of different levels so that you can argue about, you know, so people will say, I can't work because, and you can say, you can look at, well, there might be internalized ableism within there. There might be Carol Thomas calls psycho-emotional disableism, which I think is very similar to ableism. There might be impairment effects. There might also be social barriers. And our jobs as academics, I think, is to unpack that and to say, well, why is this here? Is it about psycho-emotional disableism? Have they, you know, Claire Connors and Kirsten Stalker's work on young children, young disabled children, showed how profound in the psycho-emotional barriers to to being were with young disabled people. You can't do that, you can't do that, this isn't for you. And those sorts of ideas that get constructed within them, and that creates that psycho-emotional disableism in there. So that's one thing that you might look at, but you might also look at, you know, what are the barriers that go through? And I'm thinking, for example, of one of my PhD students who from Malaysia, Aizan Sophia, and Aizan's work was on disabled women's in Malaysia's experiences, and a lot of them said they can't work, but a lot of the women had been sewing or something like that, but most of the factories where people go to be sewers are inaccessible because they're above the shops. So straight away, as well as having the social creation of disability, you can see the physical problem. Do you know, it's your job as a social scientist is to unpack that and say, why did they think like that? And then look for the causative factors of what creates that difference. Why have they got that? And I think it's one thing for what if when we do research, I feel we report both what they say, but we've got to explain what they say, analyze it, and investigate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Watson, for answering all those questions patiently. And I think we've kicked off the lecture series, in a great way with so many different kinds of questions coming in about research object, research method, and also research approach. I think this has been a very useful start for those of us who are going to stay the course of all the lectures and probably take up these questions in different ways as we hear other speakers. Someshwar, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shilpa, for moderating the session. And I would like to express my deep sense of gratitude to Professor Watson for inaugurating this series of lectures. And if this is a sign to things to come, we are really in for a treat. In such a short span of time, you covered so much and in a sense laid down the foundation for a lot of the people who are being initiated into disability studies to approach the discipline from particular perspectives. You outlined that we as intellectuals are very good at diagnosing problems. And perhaps the greatest problem that disability studies encounter is that it deals with a very complex phenomena. And hence, over a period of time, it has shifted its focus from the medical model to the social model, evolving into a kind of critical disability perspective and into the critical realist perspective. And using these as launch pads, I think that our students and scholars alike would be able to engage with the discipline productively over the next week and perhaps for years to come. So thank you so much, Professor Watson, for such a wonderful lecture and really kicking off our series of lectures in the way you did. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. And I hope that this is definitely the first time, but not the last time that you have with us. We really need you going ahead and to promote the cause of disability studies in India. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'd just like to say thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you for such an engaging audience. It's really great to get so many really good and challenging questions. And I hope it's been, and I'm trying to point, I'm not trying to, one of the things I want to make, I'm not trying to say this is what you should do. I'm trying to look at different ways so that people come through. And I know that there's lots of ways of approaching disability studies. And I hope that I've gone some way towards doing that. But thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Watson.